Okay, so let's dive right into one of the biggest questions you can possibly ask. What is reality actually made of? We're going to deconstruct this really fascinating dialogue that tackles this exact problem and turns some ancient philosophy into a pretty clear modern Q&A. We're going to start with this really powerful quote. It kind of hints that the answer isn't about, winning some debate or argument. It's about achieving a certain state of mind. It's a clue that maybe, just maybe, the real truth is hiding behind our own perceptions. So this is the big question we're diving into. How do we get past all the noise, all the conflicting ideas, to find something that feels like a stable truth? Well, let's follow a seeker who asked this very question thousands of years ago.
All right, so first up, let's get into the seeker's question. Our journey here doesn't start with an answer. Nope, it starts with a problem, a moment of really deep confusion about the very nature of reality itself.
So, meet Uddhava. He's a really sharp guy, totally dedicated, but he is completely and utterly confused. See, he's been listening to all the great teachers and sages, but they all seem to contradict each other on the most basic point. What is the universe actually made of?
And this, right here, is his problem. I mean, he's heard some sages say there are 26 fundamental elements. Okay, but then others say no, it's 25. Then he hears 7, then 9, 6, 4, 17. The list just keeps going. It's a total mess of conflicting numbers from people who are all supposed to be enlightened.
So Uddhava asks the only logical question you can ask at this point. How can they all be right? If they're all so wise, why are their answers so wildly different? It's a fantastic question, and it gets right to the heart of everything. And this brings us to Krishna's first, just brilliant response. And it's not about picking a number. It's about changing our whole perspective on what an answer even is. Krishna's answer is, well, it's profound. He basically says, hey, they're all correct. The conflict isn't in reality itself, but in how we humans love to categorize things. It's like asking how many parts a car has. The answer really depends on if you're counting every last nut and bolt, or if you're just counting the big things, like the engine, the wheels, and the chassis. And this is where it all just clicks into place. This table shows us exactly what he means. So in perspective A, a sage might count just the 5 material elements plus the supreme soul. That gives them a nice neat total of 6. Simple, right? But now, look down at perspective D. Here, another sage is looking at the very same reality, but with like a philosophical microscope. They're counting the 5 elements, their 5 sense objects, the 5 senses, the mind, and the soul. And boom, they get 17. It's not a contradiction at all. It's just a different zoom level.
So, you see, the goal isn't to find the one true number. The real goal is to understand the underlying system so well that you can see how all the different counts make perfect logical sense. For someone who really gets it, there is no contradiction.
Okay, on to section 3, the silent witness. So Uddhava is pretty satisfied with the whole metaphysics thing, but now he's got a deeper, way more personal question about the nature of the self.
He asks, okay, I get it, but if the soul is pure spirit and nature is just matter, then why does it feel like I, the soul, am completely caught up in all the drama of my body and my thoughts? Why do they feel like they're one and the same thing?
And Krishna's response here is that this feeling of being entangled, that's the illusion. He explains that it's just a temporary state, almost like a special effect created by his divine energy, making 2 totally distinct things appear to be one.
Krishna uses this amazing analogy to explain it, which this slide lays out perfectly. He compares our senses to the reflection of the sun in our eye. Now, that reflection lets us see, but it's completely dependent on the original sun up in the sky. The soul, he says, is like that original sun. It's the real source of all perception, while our senses are just the reflections, the tools it uses to see. All right, section 4, how the soul travels. This leads to the next logical question, right? If the soul is just a witness, then what in the world happens when the body dies?
And Uddhava phrases it perfectly. He asks, for those people who are still caught up in that illusion of being entangled, the ones who haven't realized their true nature as the silent witness, what's the mechanism that carries them from one life to the next?
So Krishna breaks it down into 3 simple steps. First, the mind, which has been shaped by all our past actions, our karma. It bundles itself together with the 5 senses. Second, this little mind and senses package is what actually travels from one body to another. And third, the soul itself, which is totally separate from all this. It just follows along, like a silent observer on a journey.
And this brings us to the final, and, let me tell you, maybe the most mind-bending part of this whole explanation. what life and death truly are from this perspective. To explain this illusion of having a single, continuous self throughout a whole lifetime, Krishna uses two really powerful metaphors, a river's current and a lamp's flame.
And this slide just nails it. You look at a river and you say, hey, that's the same river I saw yesterday. But is it? No way. It's made of completely new water constantly flowing past. Well, in the exact same way, we look in the mirror and think, yep, that's me. But our body is made of constantly changing cells. Our thoughts are always shifting. Our experiences are always new. The continuity we feel, it's an illusion.
Now get ready for this, because this is a revolutionary idea. In this teaching, death isn't a biological event. Krishna defines death as the moment of total forgetfulness, that moment when a being becomes so absorbed in the identity of its dying body that it completely forgets its true nature as the eternal soul. And all of those stages we identify with so strongly, conception, birth, childhood, youth, middle age, old age, and finally death, they're just temporary phases of the body. They happen to the body, but they are only ever witnessed by the silent, unchanging soul.
And so, we end by turning this incredible ancient dialogue right back to you. If everything you typically call me, your body, your memories, your personality, is in constant flux, just like the water in that river, then what is that constant, unchanging awareness that has been silently watching it all unfold this whole time? That's the ultimate question this whole thing leaves us with.
Welcome to the deep dive. We take these really dense philosophical texts, break them down, and try to get to the core truths, basically giving you a way to be genuinely informed without, spending decades studying.
And today, we're tackling something that, honestly, stumps a lot of people, even seasoned seekers.
Yeah, it's a real paradox. You try to figure out the fundamental building blocks of everything, the tattvas, the elements of creation, and the greatest sages, the most respected sources, they give you completely different numbers, like wildly different. Why?
It really is a kind of crisis of consensus in metaphysics, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we're not just talking small disagreements here.
No, not at all. We're jumping into this incredibly deep dialogue. It's between Uddhava and the Supreme Lord himself, a key source.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Uddhava basically voices this exact confusion. He says, look, I've heard you, the Lord, mention counts of 9 elements, 11, 5, 3.
Right, just from the Lord himself. And then he goes on, he says, other sages I've heard from, they talk about 26 elements.
Or 25.
25, 7, 6, 4.
17, 16, 13.
It's just a mess of numbers. Imagine you're trying to learn this stuff, build a coherent picture. How do you even start with that? It feels impossible.
It really does. So
Oh.
that's our mission today, figure out the Lord's answer to this. The big question, really the heart of this deep dive, is how can all these seemingly conflicting ways of counting be considered valid, logically consistent? Yukta matvat.
Are they all somehow right? Or is this just, I don't know, philosophy saying anything goes?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. We're exploring this idea of relative truth, but one that's still anchored in an absolute reality underneath it all.
Okay, so not just everyone's right, but there's a mechanism.
Exactly. A mechanism rooted in how we perceive the universe. It's actually quite sophisticated. Let's unpack it. So the Lord's first response is actually quite reassuring. He says, yeah, the differences are reasonable, yukta.
Reasonable. Okay, that's surprising. But why? What makes contradictory counts reasonable?
Here's the critical part. He says the reason is that the speakers, the sages giving these different counts, are operating under the influence of his own illusory energy, māyā.
Wow. Okay, so the very way reality presents itself causes the disagreement.
Precisely. It's like, imagine trying to describe the color of a room when everyone's wearing different colored glasses provided by the room's designer.
You can't objectively see the true color because the viewing mechanism itself is influenced.
Exactly. The arguments themselves, he says, are caused by his insurmountable potencies, shaktayo. It's not a bug. It's a feature of the cosmic system.
A feature designed to, what? Keep us engaged in the material world, confused.
Perhaps engaged is a good way to put it. The debate itself arises because our perception is filtered, separating how we see things from the absolute truth behind them.
But he doesn't just leave it at its illusion. He gives a technical reason for the numbers varying, right? This is where it gets really fascinating for me.
Yes, the core mechanism is what the texts call interpenetration, or overlapping. The terms are vyatikarat, or Paraspado and Prabhupada.
Interpenetration. Okay, so the elements aren't like separate Lego blocks.
Not entirely. Think of them more like interwoven threads, or maybe those Russian nesting dolls. We like to define things discretely. Earth, water, fire, air, ether.
Right. Separate categories.
But the sources explain that each element inherently contains aspects of the others. To even have earth as we know it, you need the fire aspect for its form or heat, the water for cohesion, air for movement within it, ether for the space it occupies.
Ah, I see. You can't truly isolate them. They depend on each other to even exist in the way we perceive them.
Exactly. And because you can't fully isolate them, how you count them depends entirely on what you're trying to explain or achieve philosophically, your goal.
The speaker's intention. What was the term?
Vaktur vivakatam, the intention of the speaker. That dictates the count.
Okay, let's make that concrete. Use the architect analogy you mentioned earlier.
Right. So imagine two architects looking at the same building. Architect 1 is a structural engineer.
Okay.
Their intention, Vaktur vivakaitam, is to understand the fundamental supports. So they count foundation, load-bearing walls, roof structure, maybe just 3 core components.
That maps to the simpler tattva counts, like 3 or 5.
Yeah.
Focusing on the big primary causes, like pratati.
Exactly, the primal causes. But now, Architect 2 comes along. She's an interior designer.
Different intention entirely.
Completely. Her job requires accounting for the human experience inside the building. So she counts the 5 types of textures, the objects of perception, the 5 types of sensors needed, eyes for light, ears for sound, etc.
Plus the lighting fixtures, the fire element, the plumbing water, ventilation air.
Right. Her count balloons up to maybe 25 or 26 elements because her intention is focused on the apparatus of experience, not just the foundational structure.
And the Lord says both counts are okay.
Yes, he confirms this. He accepts any statement, any count that is both distinct, the victim, clearly defined in its own terms, and logically possible or consistent, yukti sambhavad.
So it's not about the final number, but the internal logic and the clarity of the definition based on the intended scope.
Precisely. It's a massive endorsement of a kind of philosophical pluralism, grounded in logical consistency and methodology, not just a single correct number.
That really reframes the whole debate. The conflict isn't error, it's just different perspectives driven by different intentions.
And the Lord adds a crucial spiritual point here. He says this whole confusion, these endless debates, it exists, it doesn't exist, arguing about counts, it only truly ceases when one achieves control over the mind and senses, samadhamma.
Ah. So the intellectual wrestling itself is a symptom of an uncontrolled mind.
That's the implication. It's the noise generated by inner agitation. A realized soul, someone with shamadhamma, still perceives the elements, of course, but their attachment to one specific number just dissolves. They see the underlying unity through the apparent diversity.
The pursuit of the number becomes secondary, or maybe even irrelevant once the inner state is calm.
Exactly. It's a temporary stage in the journey, driven by the very māyā that causes the varied perceptions in the first place.
Okay. And if the elements overlap and our perception is inherently filtered by māyā, that suggests we probably can't fix this perception on our own, right?
That's the logical next step. It leads directly into the individual's path and the need for guidance.
Right. So the conversation then shifts, doesn't it? It moves to the individual seeker's journey. Because we're all kind of stuck in this, what's the term, beginningless ignorance.
Anajavidya, yes.
Yeah.
And because of that inherent condition, the text implies we can't just bootstrap ourselves into enlightenment purely through our own thinking.
Which explains the need for a teacher, a guide.
The necessity of instruction, yes. Someone who already knows the truth, a Tattva-jñāna. If self-realization was just automatic, why would the Lord himself need to be explaining all this to Uddhava?
Good point. The act of teaching itself implies a need for knowledge to be transmitted to correct that inherent ignorance.
And before diving into the specific counts Uddhava heard, the Lord makes a really fundamental point about the nature of the self.
What's that?
He clarifies the relationship between the individual soul, the Puro, and the Supreme Lord, Uddhava. He says there is not the slightest distinction between them, navalakam and api.
No difference at all.
Fundamentally, no.
Yeah.
Any idea that they are somehow different, in essence, made of different stuff. He says that conception is meaningless, Aparsa.
That's huge. But wait, what about knowledge itself? Isn't knowing something the soul does?
This is a subtle but crucial distinction. The capacity for awareness belongs to the soul, which is pure consciousness. But the act of knowing, the functional knowledge, jnana we use to process the world, that's described as merely a quality, a gut, belonging to material nature, prakte.
So the knowledge I use is part of the material system, not my pure self.
Correct. The soul's awareness. The operational knowledge is a tool provided by nature.
Okay. And what powers this whole material operation? That brings us to the modes of nature, the guttas, right?
Exactly. The gutas are the engine. Sattva, goodness, clarity. Rajas, passion, activity. And tamas, ignorance, inertia. Their interplay, their equilibrium or lack thereof, belongs entirely to prakriti, material nature.
Not the soul. The soul just witnesses this interplay.
Or gets caught up in identifying with it. But fundamentally, these three modes are the forces driving creation, maintenance, and destruction. Siti Atpati Antahedavas. They're like the primary colors that mix to create every shade of material experience.
And they map directly to psychological states, too. Sattva is...
Sattva is identified with knowledge, clarity, understanding, illumination.
Rajas is...
Rajas is work or action, karma, activity, drive, restlessness, passion.
In tamas.
Tamas is nescience or ignorance,
Okay.
ajanam. Inertia, delusion, heaviness, confusion.
This three-part system generates everything we experience, and the pure soul mistakenly thinks, this is me.
That's the core of the entanglement.
Yeah.
Now let's go back to Uddhava's confusion about the numbers and look at a couple of specific counts to really nail down that idea of Vaktar Vivakaman, the speaker's intention.
Okay, good idea. Let's start simple. What about the 9 elements count, the Navatattva? Why 9? What's the intention there?
The intention behind the 9 count is really fundamental, focusing on the major cosmic causes. It lists
Okay.
1, the soul, Pura. 2, material nature, Pratiki. 3, the manifest totality, sometimes called Mahatattva or cosmic intelligence, Jektam. 4, false ego, Ahakara.
That's 4.
And then the 5 gross elements, ether, air, fire, water, earth. That makes 9.
So this list is basically asking, what are the absolute essential ingredients needed for anything to manifest? The cosmic recipe.
Precisely. It's looking at the universe from a top-down causal perspective. But the moment you shift your focus,
From cosmic cause to individual experience.
the list has to change.
Yeah.
And that brings us to a more complex one, like the 17 Tattva Sokya count, the Saptadashaka.
17. Okay, why 17? What's the intention here? It sounds much more detailed.
It is. The intention shifts completely. The philosopher using this count isn't just looking at root causes like prakriti. They're interested in the instruments the soul uses to interact with and experience the world.
The apparatus of perception.
Exactly. So you start again with the 5 gross elements. That's the stage, the physical world.
Okay, 5.
But then, to experience that world, you need the data the world provides. So you add the 5 objects of perception: sound, touch, form, taste, smell.
Makes sense. That brings us to 10.
And to receive that data, you need the hardware. The 5 sense organs: ears, skin, eyes, nose, tongue.
15. We're getting closer.
Now you need the central processor that makes sense of all that sensory input. The mind, that's the 16th.
Mine, 16. Okay, what's 17?
The conscious experiencer itself, the individual soul, the puru, as the recipient of all this processed data. That's the 17th element in this specific count.
Ah, okay. So the 17 Tattva system is answering a different question. What are the essential components needed for a soul to consciously experience the material world?
You got it.
Okay.
And notice the difference. The 9 count leaves out the sense organs and sense objects.
Why?
Because from its cosmic perspective, those are just effects or byproducts of the gross elements and the ego. But the 17 count includes them because, from the perspective of individual experience, they are essential instruments.
Instruments versus root causes. It perfectly illustrates the Lord's point about Vaktar Vivakayam. Different questions, different intentions, different counts, both logically consistent within their own framework.
Exactly. And you can see how other variations would arise from this, like the 13 Tattva count you mentioned.
How does that work?
It simplifies again. 5 gross elements, 5 senses, the mind, the individual soul. And it explicitly adds the Supreme Lord as a distinct principle, 13.
Okay. And the 16 Tattva count.
That one often arises when the philosopher argues that, for all practical purposes in the bound state, the individual soul's experience is so tied up with the mind's activity
That you can basically count them as one functional unit.
Right. Functionally identifying the soul with the mind for the purpose of that specific analysis, collapsing 2 into 1, leading to 16, all logically possible, all acceptable, if the internal reasoning holds up.
Okay, so we've established that the numbers game is about intention and perspective, but Uddhava then raises another really deep practical question, doesn't he?
He does. And it's the one that hits home for pretty much everyone trying to live a spiritual life in a material world.
Which is?
He asks, okay, if nature, priti, and the living entity, buddhya, are fundamentally different things, distinct from the pure soul, atmavilikam, why do they feel so inseparable? Why does it seem like they rely on each other? The term is enionya pashat.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. If my soul is pure spirit, why does stubbing my toe hurt me so much? Why do I feel hunger, sadness, joy tied so tightly to this physical body and mind?
Why the intense identification? The Lord's explanation goes back to the Guhyas. He says this feeling of inseparability, this apparent distinction blurring, it's simply the result of the constant interaction, the mixing of the modes. The mixing of sattva, rajas, and tamas.
Yes. The entire world we see and feel isn't some static reality. It's a transformed creation of Vaikarika Sarga, constantly emerging from the dynamic interplay of these three modes. It's a state of perpetual flux and mixture.
And this mixture, how we perceive it, he gives that threefold structure, right? The Triveda. This seems really important for understanding experience.
It's fundamental. The Triveda framework explains why any single perception you have isn't isolated, but always depends on three interconnected factors.
Okay, break it down. What are the three?
Yeah.
First, there's the adhyatmic. This relates to the self, specifically the internal sensing faculty or power. Think of it as the instrument. For sight, it's the power of seeing, Duke, which resides in the eye, but isn't just the physical eyeball.
Okay, the internal capacity. Adhyatmic. What's second?
Second is the adidevic. This relates to the divine, the controlling deity or force associated with that sense. It's the operating power. For sight, the example given is the sun, arkai, which governs the eye's ability to function. No sunlight, no vision, generally speaking.
The enabling force. Adidevic. And third.
The third is the adibotic. This relates to the external material object of the sense, the data itself. For sight, it's the visible form, the rupai, like the apple we're looking at.
The object being perceived, adibotic. So adidatmic, sense power, adidivic, channeling force of deity, adibotic, sense object.
Exactly. And they are completely interdependent for perception to occur. Let's use your apple example.
Okay. To see the apple.
You need the adhyatmic power of sight within your eye. But that power is useless without the adidevic principle, let's say the ambient light originating from the sun or another source.
Right.
And both of those are pointless if there isn't an adibotic object, the actual physical apple, rupa, to reflect that light to the eye faculty.
So the experience of seeing the apple only arises when all three components line up and interact.
Correct. And this applies to all senses. Hearing requires the ear faculty, adhyatmic, the principle of space or direction, adidevic, and the physical sound vibration, adipatic. They co-create the experience.
It makes the world feel seamless, like it's just out there and we're just in here observing it, but really it's this constant three-way interaction.
But crucially, the Lord points out that He, the Supreme Soul, is like the original sun of the sky. He's the ultimate cause, the source of the light, but He's separate from the reflection needed for the eye to see the object.
So the soul, in its pure state, observes this Triveda interaction, but isn't actually one of the three components involved in the material perception itself.
That's the idea. So the question remains, why does the soul get tangled up? If it's separate, why does it think it's the eye or the pain or the pleasure? What's the mechanism of confusion?
And the answer is?
The false ego, ahakara.
Here it is. The sense of I.
Yes. That feeling of, I am the doer, I am the experiencer, this body is me, these thoughts are mine. This ahakara arises directly from the initial disturbance of the goas, the gokakoba.
So the imbalance in the modes creates the false ego.
It's presented as the immediate product. And this false ego is explicitly called the cause of delusion and differentiation, mohavikalpa hetu. It's what convinces the pure soul that the reflection it sees is its real self.
It generates that sense of separateness and ownership.
Exactly. And just to add another layer of complexity, the texts say this false ego itself is threefold, depending on which go dominates its formation.
Oh, of course. How so?
There's a sattvic aspect of false ego, influenced by goodness, which leads to the development of the mind and intelligence. There's a tamasic aspect, influenced by ignorance, which leads to the creation of the gross material elements. And a rajasic aspect, influenced by passion, that generates the active senses themselves.
Wow. So the false ego isn't just one thing. It's the root node from which the mind, the elements, and the senses all branch out, all colored by the modes.
That's a good way to visualize it. The entire apparatus for experiencing a separate reality stems from this initial knot of ahagara, which itself stems from the disturbed guttus.
Okay, so the sequence is disturbed modes, false ego, the whole Trivida perceptual system, mind, senses, objects, controllers. That explains the feeling of inseparable union, even though spirit and matter are distinct.
Precisely. It's a brilliantly constructed illusion designed to create subjective experience. And this entire setup is what fuels the cycle of birth and death, samsara. So, having laid out how the illusion works, the Lord briefly circles back to those philosophical debates we started with. The does it exist, astiti, or does it not exist, nastiti arguments.
What does he say about them now?
He basically reiterates that they're based on a dualistic view and are ultimately futile, yurthos. Pointless, in a way.
But he also says they never stop, right? Among a certain group of people.
Right. They never cease among those whose minds are diverted from the true self, part of athatiyam. It really drives home that earlier point. The external arguing is a symptom of internal distraction.
Energy spent debating tattva counts is energy not spent on achieving shamatama, the inner control needed for realization.
Exactly. So Uddhava, understanding this, brings the focus back to the practical consequence. Okay, if the soul gets bewildered by this false ego and turns away from the truth, how does it actually move between bodies? How does it get a high birth sometimes, a low birth other times, based on its actions, its karma?
Yeah, the mechanics of transmigration. And this is where we get that really surprising insight you mentioned about what actually moves.
Yes, this is critical for you, the listener, to grasp. When we talk about the soul transmigrating, the texts clarify that it's not the pure soul itself that's actively moving and choosing.
That's not? Then what is?
It's the mind. Mana.
The mind.
Yes. The mind is described as being karma mayam, literally composed of karma, or shaped by the tendencies of past actions. This mind, along with the subtle senses attached to it, is the vehicle that travels from one body, one world, to the next. Lokalo kala priyati.
So the soul just goes along for the ride.
It's depicted as following the mind. The mind is the active agent, driven by its ingrained desires and karmic patterns, and the soul, being passive in this dynamic, simply accompanies it, like, as you said, a prisoner being led by the jailer.
Wow. The mind is the carrier, fueled by its own past actions and desires.
And it keeps the cycle going because it constantly contemplates sense objects, things it has seen, heard, or desires. This contemplation activates or dulls the whole mechanism of work, the karma tantra.
So just thinking about sense pleasure or dwelling on past grievances, that actively fuels the engine for the next life.
That's the implication. The mental activity dictates the future trajectory, which leads to these incredibly profound redefinitions of birth and death. They're not just biological events.
Okay, this is the aha moment. What's the definition of death?
Death is defined as total forgetfulness, atyantavismritya, specifically forgetfulness of the self caused by deep absorption in sense objects via vinavijnana.
Total forgetfulness. So it's not just the heart stopping, it's a state of consciousness, when the self is completely forgotten because the mind is lost in the material world.
Exactly. Think about the implications. It suggests that profound states of absorption in the material, even while alive, maybe like severe dementia where self-awareness is lost, could be considered a form of this philosophical death, the ultimate amnesia.
That's stark. And conversely, what about birth?
Jnana. Birth is defined as the person's acceptance of sense objects, via subitim, taking on a new set of sensory inputs and experiences as real.
Acceptance of sense objects. And it's compared to what?
It's explicitly likened to the experiences you have in a dream or a fantasy, swapna manoratha.
So this life, this reality we take so seriously, is fundamentally just like entering a new dream. We accept the dreamscape, the dream body, the dream events as real while we're in it.
That's exactly the analogy. When you wake up from a night's dream, you mostly forget the details, right? It seems unreal. Similarly, at death, which is forgetfulness, you forget the dream of the previous life. Then at birth, the mind accepts a new set of sense objects, a new body, a new world, as completely fresh and real, apruva.
This just dismantles our whole sense of continuous identity. We feel like I'm the same person I was yesterday, last year.
But the texts say, hold on, that feeling is based on an illusion of permanence. The body's actually changing constantly at an imperceptible speed, alakyavajina.
Why don't we notice it moment to moment?
Because the changes are too subtle, too granular. Like watching a clock hand move, you don't see the motion, but you know it's happening.
And the analogies they use really drive this home, the body changing like.
The flickering flames of a lamp, constantly consuming fuel and changing shape, yet appearing stable. Or like the currents in a river, always flowing, never the same water twice. Or the stages of a fruit on a tree: conception, growth, ripening, decay.
Right, and we look at someone and say, oh, that's the same person I knew as a child. But that's just a mental construct.
That common idea, this is the same man, is called megirto, false words, false understanding. It's a notion held by those whose lives are based on illusion, because they don't distinguish the ever-changing physical form from the unchanging witness, the soul.
And there are specific stages listed for the body's journey, 9 of them.
Yes, the 9 avasta: conception in the womb, gestation, birth itself, childhood, boyhood, youth, middle age, old age, and finally, biological death.
9 stages, but crucially,
These are described as creations of the mind's imagination, manoratha mayor. They are markers the mind imposes on the continuous flow of change, milestones in its ongoing dream narrative. The soul itself doesn't go through these stages.
it's just the observer of the mind's story unfolding through these bodily phases.
So the ignorant person, the obadhatuman, fails to see this distinction. They get bewildered by sense contact, identify with the changing body and mind, and thus repeatedly enter material existence, sasara patipadyate. That's bondage.
And the quality of the next life, the next dream state, depends on the modes we cultivate.
Directly. This is where the Gurus determine the next chapter. If you cultivate sattva, clarity, and goodness.
You get reborn among sages or demigods. Endivan. A more lucid dream, maybe?
More illuminated state, yes. If you're dominated by rajas, passion and activity.
Rebirth among demons or humans. Asura manoan. A life of striving, conflict, intense experience.
That's the idea. And if you cultivate tamas, ignorance and inertia.
You end up among ghosts, animals, lower forms of life. Bhuta tirakva. Maximum forgetfulness, density.
Exactly. The mind clings to objects based on its dominant mode. That acceptance constitutes birth. The experience unfolds, leading to deeper forgetfulness, death, which just resets the stage for the next acceptance.
It's a completely self-perpetuating cycle, driven by the mind and fueled by karma, an engine of illusion.
Okay, so after revealing its entire mechanism that material reality is fundamentally an illusion of Vaikaltika Brahman, like suffering in a dream,
Right.
the Lord gives Uddhava some very direct, practical advice, the immediate takeaway.
Which is?
Basically, stop feeding the illusion. He says, do not enjoy sense objects using these temporary senses, mabuldhavayan sad indriyai.
Wow. Just stop. That sounds incredibly simple,
Yeah.
but impossibly hard in practice. You still have to live in the world, interact.
Exactly. And Uddhava immediately voices that practical difficulty. He speaks for all of us, really. He asks, okay, if I try to detach, if I try to live differently, I'm bound to face opposition, even abuse, from people who are still deeply caught in the illusion. How can anyone possibly endure the suffering caused by wicked or ignorant people?
Yeah, that's a very real concern. If you stop playing the game, the other players might not like it.
And the Lord acknowledges this reality quite starkly. He lists a whole catalog of potential persecutions that the seeker, the Shayas-kama, one who desires the highest good, might face from the ignorant, the ajayai.
And it's not minor stuff, is it?
No, it's serious. He mentions being insulted, dishonored, mocked, envied, kapto vamanito sad.
Okay, verbal and social abuse.
Then it gets physical. Being beaten, bound, or even deprived of your livelihood, tatitaf sanarudo favityava parahapita.
So, violence and economic hardship.
And even utter degradation, being spat upon or urinated upon or otherwise defiled niyatito matritova. The text doesn't shy away from depicting potentially extreme reactions to someone trying to live a detached life.
It paints a grim picture of what one might face for trying to step outside the norms of material attachment.
It does. But here's where the philosophy has to meet the road. If the Lord just finished explaining that the entire material world, including the actions of others, is driven by the gujas and māyā,
Then why should the seeker differentiate between suffering caused by a person spitting on them and suffering caused by, say, getting caught in a hailstorm or falling ill?
exactly. From the ultimate perspective, he just outlined, aren't both just external phenomena arising from the interplay of material nature, prati? Uddhava frames it as persecution by others, but the underlying metaphysics suggests it's just another ripple in the illusion.
The source of the suffering isn't really the external agent, the person, the storm, the disease, but my internal reaction to it, my attachment, my identification.
That's the necessary conclusion. And therefore, the solution, even when you're in that state of extreme difficulty, Katragatha, has to be internal.
What is the solution given?
The seeker must uplift himself by his own intelligence. Atmanatmanamudharat. Self-reliance through wisdom.
Uplift the self by the self. So the external event happens, someone insults me, spits on me, whatever, but my intelligence, informed by this understanding, has to kick in.
Right. The intelligence has to recognize, okay, this body being insulted is temporary matter. The action of this other person is just a manifestation of their own ignorance, their guchas. My feeling of being hurt or outraged is my own false ego reacting.
So the self, armed with this knowledge, rescues itself from collapsing under the weight of the material event.
It's the ultimate application of the life as a dream realization. If someone attacks you in a dream, do you spend your energy fighting the dream figure? Or do you try to realize you're dreaming and wake up?
You try to wake up. Fighting the dream figure is pointless.
Now, Uddhava, hearing this, acknowledges just how hard this is. He says something like, I think this is extremely difficult to endure. Kudusahami manmenye.
He admits it's a tough path.
Yes, because, he observes, even for learning people, prakriti, material nature, is just incredibly powerful. Balyasi, the pull of the illusion, the force of habit, the reaction of the ego, it's strong.
Even when you intellectually know it's illusion, feeling it is another matter, the ingrained reactions are powerful.
Very powerful. But then Uddhava himself provides the conditions, the formula, for actually overcoming this powerful nature. It's not just about intellect. It requires specific supports.
Okay, what are the conditions for success?
He identifies 3 key factors for those who manage to navigate Prakriti's power. They must. 1, take shelter of the Lord's feet, karanayan.
So devotion, surrender to a higher principle. It's not just self-effort.
Correct. 2, they must remain devoted to his dharma, their prescribed duty, their spiritual path.
Structure, practice, discipline, following a specific way of life.
Yes. And 3, as a result of the first 2, they become peaceful, Shantam.
Inner peace. That's the outcome, and also the shield.
Exactly. That inner tranquility born from devotion and disciplined practice is what ultimately makes the external attacks ineffective. It allows the seeker to see the persecution for what it is, just another irrelevant feature of the dream, and not be disturbed by it.
So, enduring life isn't about winning the external battles, which are part of the illusion anyway. It's about cultivating that inner peace through spiritual practice and shelter, which then provides the resilience.
That seems to be the core message. The victory is internal, and it comes through a combination of understanding, practice, and reliance on the divine. #outro.
Wow. Okay, that was quite a journey we took there. We started with what seemed like just a numerical puzzle.
Right, the chaos of counting tattvas 3, 17, 26.
And we found the solution wasn't picking the right number, but understanding the principle of interpenetration, how elements overlap, and how the speaker's intention, Vaktur Vivaitam, determines the count logically.
And then we shifted from those abstract principles to the very nature of our own conscious existence. We saw how false ego creates this apparent union of spirit and matter through the Trivita framework.
Which then powers the mind, described as karma māyā, literally made of past actions.
And that mind is the engine pulling the soul through cycles of birth and death.
And realizing the body is constantly changing makes that feeling of, I'm the same person, fundamentally illusory.
And those definitions. Birth is just accepting new dream objects. Death is total spiritual forgetfulness. Really changes your perspective.
It absolutely does. So the ultimate takeaway isn't about winning philosophical debates about tattva counts.
No, it's about achieving that inner control of mind and senses, shamadhamma. That's what stops the endless, futile arguments, and more importantly, gives you the strength to endure the difficulties of life by seeing through the illusion.
It gives you the ability to uplift yourself with your own intelligence, as the text says, anchored by practice and devotion.
That internal escape hatch is always there, but accessing it requires constant self-awareness, doesn't it? Because we know the mind, just by contemplating external things, is fueling that engine.
Right. The karma tantra, the mechanism of action, is constantly being wound up by what the mind dwells on.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to maybe reflect on.
If the mind fuels the next cycle every time it gets absorbed in things seen or heard, think about your own daily life. What specific, maybe almost unconscious habit do you have? Something you do regularly, perhaps just for sensory pleasure or distraction, that you now realize might actually be winding up that karma tantra, actively fueling the mechanism for your next life, your next dream. Just something to consider as you go about your day.
Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on a really profound instruction found deep within the material, one that sets up a fascinating philosophical tension regarding the very nature of truth itself.
Exactly. The material's structure kind of forces us to confront this paradox directly. We're given Uddhava's query, where he notes the sheer variation in how different sages enumerate the fundamental building blocks of reality, the tattvas. He hears counts ranging wildly 9, 11, 17, 26.
And this isn't just some, taxonomic footnote. It cuts right to the heart of epistemology. If multiple, distinct systems claim to describe the essential truth of existence, well, how can they all be valid? So the central question before us is this: does the material's explicit validation of these diverse tattva systems, each justified by its own internal context and logic, does that ultimately undermine the text's own, very clear, non-dualistic conclusion that the individual soul and the Supreme Lord are fundamentally non-distinct?
Yeah, that's the crux of it.
My position, the advocate's position, is that the text explicitly endorses a form of pluralistic epistemology. It validates these diverse frameworks as legitimate, contextual truth.
And I come at it from a different angle. While the differences are certainly acknowledged as a starting point, I think the ultimate philosophical pivot of the instruction is firmly toward a singular non-dualistic ontology. I maintain that the text ultimately renders all these differentiated systematic explanations of the material world, no matter how logically detailed, as merely temporary products of māyā, and therefore secondary to the absolute necessity of self-realization.
Okay, I see why you think that, because the ultimate conclusion is undeniably non-dual. But let me first establish why the material validates the pluralistic approach, at least on the systematic level. When Uddhava asks why these differing counts exist, the response isn't dismissive at all. In fact, it's quite an affirmation of contextual truth. The instruction is explicit when summarizing the validity of these varied counts in verse 25. All are valid, being reasonable, yaktimatvat.
Reasonable.
Yeah, reasonable. This is a powerful endorsement of intellectual rigor, right? The systems are validated not because they describe the absolute final truth, maybe, but because they are logically sound within their own parameters. And this validation seems to hinge on two crucial principles. First, this idea of parasparana privyasat, or the interpenetration of elements. Because the elements contain others within them, sages are free to enumerate them as prior or posterior, according to the speaker's intention, vaktir vivikshitam.
Right.
So this means that truth on the systematic, descriptive level is inherently pluralistic. It's context-dependent. If the intention or context dictates the count, if you choose to count the gunas separately or include mind and intelligence, then diverse models, like the 9-element model or the 17-element Sankhya model, will they function as equally useful and logically consistent representations of reality? It's like we're provided with many maps because the terrain of the cosmos is vastly complex, and different maps serve different purposes.
Okay, that's a compelling argument for the utility of structural analysis, I grant you that. But have you considered the immediate context in which that diversity is introduced? I take issue with how you're framing that reasonableness. The Lord acknowledges these differing opinions, sure, but he immediately attributes their very existence to the operation of his insurmountable potencies, shaktio medharatya, potencies which, the text says, inevitably lead to vikalpa, or difference of opinion, verses 5 and 6. The systems arise from māyā. You can't just separate the logical consistency, yukti-matvat, from the illusory nature of the field on which that consistency operates. Furthermore, the text provides a categorical ultimate truth mandate in verse 11. There is not the slightest distinction between the individual soul and the Supreme Lord, Purushaishwarayo atranna vayalakshenyam anapapi. Any other conception that posits fundamental separation is simply declared meaningless apartha. Now, if the ultimate non-dual truth renders all separation meaningless, how can these detailed, differentiated tattva systems possibly retain validity beyond a purely provisional, maybe even illusory level?
See, this is where we fundamentally disagree on the path versus the destination. You seem to jump straight to the ultimate realization, almost declaring the path irrelevant. But the path is where we are, isn't it?
If the diverse tattva systems are just dismissed as illusory from the outset, mere products of māyā, then why does the text dedicate significant passages to meticulously explaining how these varied counts are formulated? Why bother detailing the mechanisms of transformation? It feels like the text takes the structural explanation very seriously as a means to understanding bondage.
Well, I'd say it's detailed to serve as a diagnostic tool. It shows how ignorance operates, not to validate the resulting systems as ultimate truth. We really need to look closely at the relationship between intellectual consistency and transcendental experience. You noted that the acceptance of varied systems relies on reasoned coherence, yuktimatvat, that's undeniably intellectual. And you believe this confirms systematic approaches as a necessary path.
Yes, a necessary part of the path.
Okay, but I would suggest that intellectual systems, while maybe necessary for the embodied soul's functioning, are inherently limited. Consider what the material says about the gunas. It identifies goodness with knowledge, sattvam-jnanam, passion with work, and ignorance with nations, right? But knowledge, jnanam itself, is explicitly described as an attribute of prakriti, material nature, in verse 11, part of the material energy. Exactly. So if the very concept of knowledge, jnanam, is bounded by material nature, how can a philosophical system derived from that knowledge offer liberation from material nature? It seems, well, self-defeating. The text provides a far more powerful answer, I think. Argument and disagreement, vivada, only cease when control of the mind and senses is achieved. Prapte shamadame, verse 6. The resolution, therefore, isn't achieved through a superior logical model, one tattva system beating the others, but through self-realization that transcends the very basis of these enumerations.
I certainly acknowledge that shama, tranquility, and dhamma, self-control, are the ultimate solvents. Absolutely. However, the path to achieving them is often paved by analytical discrimination, isn't it? The mind is controlled by the intelligence, the buddhi. If one lacks the structural knowledge to discriminate the self from the body and the senses, knowledge which is provided precisely by these tattva systems, how can one effectively achieve shamadhamma? It seems like a prerequisite.
Furthermore, consider the statement that disputes, the it exists or it does not exist arguments. Asti iti, nasti iti, are declared pseudo vyartha only for those whose minds are diverted from the Supreme, verse 33. That's a crucial qualifier. It implies that for the non-realized, which is, let's face it, most of us, these systematic debates hold provisional, even vital, meaning in correcting that initial diversion. The knowledge is required to properly focus the mind so that transcendence eventually becomes possible.
You might be confusing means with ends there. The knowledge is useful for diagnostic purposes, yes, I agree. But its provisional status is what truly matters from an ultimate perspective. Let's focus for a moment on the meaning of differentiation itself, vikalpa. The Lord makes it crystal clear that the distinction we typically draw between nature, prakriti, and the living being, purushascha, is merely a vikalpa, a differentiation created by the interaction of the modes, guna vyaitikaratmaka, verse 29.
Okay.
This means the very act of categorization, of creating a tattva list, is itself a function of the gunas. The creation resulting from these transformations, vaikārika hasarga, is characterized by those threefold aspects, the subjective, objective, and the presiding forces, verse 30. This strongly implies, to me at least, that all categorized, differential systems, no matter how clever or internally consistent they seem, are intrinsically derivative. They are not fundamentally real. They are, essentially, variations on the theme of illusion. So why would we invest ultimate meaning in something defined right there as a temporary differentiation?
But if the differentiations, the vikalpa, are merely illusory and, destined to be discarded, then the text's extensive detailing of the mechanisms of material transformation becomes philosophically confusing, doesn't it? The Lord provides a precise multiverse detailing of material life describing the 9 stages of the body from conception to death and the influence of the gunas on rebirth. Sages achieve higher realms, humans stay in the middle, animals descend, verse 51.
It describes the prison layout.
Exactly. This extensive structural knowledge suggests that these vikalpas, while perhaps ultimately illusory, are pragmatically, experientially real for the soul trapped in samsara. You can't really solve a problem you haven't adequately described. The problem of cyclical existence requires structural analysis, understanding how the, say, 9 elements of existence contribute to your bondage. The pluralistic Tattva systems are essential operational maps for navigating this complex, confusing terrain we find ourselves in.
But the goal isn't to analyze samsara perpetually. The goal is escaping the delusion born of failing to perceive the true self, Atma Agrahana Nirbhatam, verse 56. The ultimate teaching equates material existence, samsara itself, with dreams or fantasies, Swapna Maratha, verse 54. I mean, if I wake up from a dream, I don't sit there and analyze the logic of its internal physics. I recognize its falseness, its lack of substance.
Her point about the dream analogy.
And the core transcendental teaching here is radical non-dualism. The concept that this is the same man persisting through life's changes is declared mrirsha, false, verse 44. The true self is the distinct observer, the drashta, separate from the body's constant transformation, verse 49. This fundamental non-dual position, I argue, renders all attempts to categorize material components, the tattvas, secondary, and ultimately, maybe even misleading, if they distract from the primary realization of separation from the material field.
Okay, but I'd argue that recognizing the falsehood of the persisting material self is the result of having internalized the analytical mechanisms of māyā, which are described precisely by these tattva systems. You have to first grasp the temporal fluidity of material reality, that the body is constantly changing, like, the flames of a lamp or the water in a river, before you can truly grasp the static reality of the self. The analysis enables the distinction.
Enables, perhaps, but doesn't constitute the final step.
Agreed, but it's a necessary step. Furthermore, let's look at the counsel given to Uddhava right near the end. He's told to endure persecution and uplift himself by his own intelligence, atmana uddhahet, verse 58. This is an explicit mandate for the use of buddhi, intelligence. This internal resolve relies on sophisticated intelligence to understand why insults from the ignorant, ajnayar, are inconsequential. You need that framework.
Intelligence directed inward, though.
Directed inward, yes, but informed by an understanding of the outward. The initial pluralistic acceptance of tattva counts yuktimatvat shows, I think, that the path to liberation isn't just a single rigid theoretical model. It requires the embodied soul to embrace various intellectual perspectives to achieve analytical clarity, to gather the necessary structural knowledge before reaching that final non-dual realization. The diversity is the necessary starting point for comprehensive understanding, not some inherent error to be immediately discarded.
That instruction to Uddhava to use intelligence is crucial, I agree. But it's intelligence used in self-realization, not intelligence used to continue generating endlessly varying taxonomies of the material world. I still maintain that while I appreciate the argument for the operational utility of these analytical maps, that utility doesn't equate to ontological validity. The text's ultimate message is, I believe, a sharp repudiation of the differentiated mind, framing categorization itself as a product of the gunas. The systems are useful only insofar as they point the individual back toward the necessity of control of mind and senses, steering away from the endless loop of argumentation, vivada, which is declared futile for the diverted mind.
So my position remains, the text validates multiple, reasoned, and contextual frameworks, yuktimatvat, as legitimate ways to describe the universe. They provide essential, structural knowledge for the embodied soul to navigate the reality of samsara while still within it.
And I reaffirm that the ultimate philosophical truth presented in the material is starkly non-dual. All systematic differentiations, including these varied tattva counts, are ultimately derivative, consequences of the modes and māyā. They must be fully transcended by self-realization. If the final truth is non-difference, then the systems of difference are ultimately dissolved.
Ultimately, what this debate really illuminates is the profound tension within the source material itself, this tension between the necessity of defining the parts of the whole for analysis.
Right.
And the simultaneous, equally emphatic teaching that the whole fundamentally transcends all defined parts. It's a paradox baked into the instruction.
Indeed. And the differing intentions,
The intention to analyze the structure of the world for, let's say, pragmatic application, versus the intention to realize the nature of the self for ultimate liberation, well, they can clearly lead to opposing yet, as we've seen, credible interpretations of the very same extra instruction. It really forces the reader, I think, to acknowledge that intellectual rigor and radical transcendence must somehow coexist, or at least inform each other, on the journey to understanding.